Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Savvy Entrepreneur. Today, we'll be speaking with our local representative, Mr. Jonathan Singer. Mr. Singer has been in office for over 8 years and has done some amazing things since he's taken office. And without further ado, here's the man himself, Mr. Singer. Jonathan, how are you doing today?
So far, so good. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I'm really excited about our conversation today. So, Jonathan, you've been in office for 8 years now. Tell me about your experience being a legislator.
You know, uh, it's the honor of a lifetime. I'm still, without words to really describe what it's like. It is an opportunity to be able to change the lives of millions of people almost in a heartbeat. And when you look back at those 8 years, I couldn't have imagined what we actually accomplished. Whether it was, championing a tax on marijuana that went to schools and helped solve our opioid crisis, or whether it was working with our immigrant communities hand in hand to be able to stand up to Donald Trump and say, you know what? No, we are going to make sure that everyone gets a driver's license in Colorado if they pay for it, get car insurance. Um, I would have never imagined, 9 years ago as a child protection caseworker that I would have had the opportunity to do that and step up for foster kids, champion mental health, and, change oil and gas laws in a way that no one would have expected that long ago.
You definitely had some great accomplishments in your time in office. So, what sparked your motivation to become a politician?
I don't even use that word. I say public servant. I'm a career social worker. I started out in my 20s working in social work because I saw how the deck was stacked against the people who had, the least cards to hold in the first place. And, that always rubbed me the wrong way. And so I started getting involved because there was an old quote by Ralph Nader that said, if you're not turned on to politics, politics will turn on you, and it's true. And so I took everything that I learned working with homeless families, working for government agencies on behalf of abused and neglected kids, and said, you know what, I'm going to flip the script and break through that bureaucratic wall. And the only way to do it was really to run for office and tell people what it's really like, and then start changing the rules of the game for the people that deserve it the most.
That's great. So, tell us about that first run, that first time that you got the gall to just do it.
So I'm not sure it was completely legal or constitutional the first time I did it. A lot of people don't know this story, but back in 2000, I want to say it was 2000. I saw that I was unaffiliated voter at the time, and I saw that Bob Schaefer was running without any progressive opposition, and so there was a write-in uh, ballot for any there was a write-in section there, and so I just wrote to my college newspaper and said, you know what, I'm going to run for office, and I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. But if I was to consider myself a part of a party, I'd consider myself part of the person party because I'm the only person in my party. Um, and I'm about people and standing up for whether it was workers' rights, women's rights, a lot of the things that Bob Schaefer didn't stand up for. And so it turns out that the only way to get a write-in slot on there was to get enough signatures, which actually someone else had done who was actually of legal age to run for Congress. So I didn't win, but I also didn't ask for a recount. So
Hmm.
yeah, no, it wasn't close because I probably shouldn't have even said that I was running for office. So, um, but basically, I got bit by a bug that said, if you don't feel like someone's standing up for you, you should stand up for yourself. And that's what I've been able to do now in office and out of office.
How old were you when you ran the first time?
12. No, I was no, I think I was 20, 21 years old at the time. So.
And what was the minimum age
It's
required?
20. Is still 25. You got to be 25 to run for Congress. And even in Colorado, you have to be 25 to run for the state house. And we tried to change the constitution on that a couple of years ago, and even the voters wouldn't lower the age to run. So
Hmm.
figure if you're old enough to be tried as an adult, you should be able to change the laws that try you as an adult.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
but the voters disagreed with that. We put it on the ballot, and that's democracy for you.
That's the way a cookie crumbles, right?
If everything passed on its first go around, we probably wouldn't have all the problems we have today. So,
Speaking of legislation, what other legislation have you worked on or that you were planning on working on if you weren't term limited?
there's a ton of things that I would have liked to have gotten to. I mean, it really runs the gamut. So I'll only list a couple of them. There were a couple of bills that really unfortunately died this year because of the COVID crisis. you know, uh, we didn't have as much time as we normally do. We only have a 120-day session, and I think we only spent about 84 of that this year, in part because of social distancing and not wanting to turn the Capitol into a petri dish that would have created a super spreader situation.
Like what happened
And
in Mississippi?
Right. Well, it was, yeah. I mean, not to digress, but that there were some places that had some really creative opportunities and changes. I know one state actually used a basketball stadium, and so that way you could socially distance and still get your work done. But that being said, we had some disappointing losses this year. Probably the one that was most heartbreaking to me was a domestic violence protection bill that I've been working on, especially in the era of COVID. That's even more important because people literally feel like they're trapped with their abusive partners. And so I always tell people, don't be afraid to reach out, whether it's to the Safe House Progressive Alliance or to, um, uh, wherever you live, to the local safe house, and get your options and make sure that you're safe. Um, but that being said, there's a loophole in our own gun laws that basically allows people who have restraining orders and protection orders that are already out against them to continue to hold on to their firearms. And it's because sheriffs can't enforce that law right now. It is really up to our judges to enforce that law. And our judges don't have the time, the money, the wherewithal, and haven't done it for really the last 6 or 7 years with any sort of frequency. And so we were really going to flip the script and make sure that survivors of domestic violence wouldn't be at risk because their abusers are so easily able to get their hands on firearms right now. Unfortunately, that bill died because we ran out of time, and coronavirus was really sort of ruling the issues of the day. I, you know, on a broader perspective, I would have loved to see, especially in an economic crisis, a universal basic income bill. I'd started working on one a couple of years ago, and anytime there's a new concept, it's really hard to get new ideas out there onto people's plates, and so we weren't able to get enough support to really find a way to get it introduced. And that happened with a lot of our bills this year. We were trying to create a city-run or state-run banking system. Once again, a lot of those issues, whether it was on economic justice or justice for survivors of domestic violence, these things fell by the wayside in the wake of the worst pandemic that we've seen in over a century.
Hmm. That's tragic that those protections that you were working on weren't able to get turned into real legislation. In Colorado, there are term limits. You want to discuss that and elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, no. So once again, Colorado's very interesting, but the voters a number of years ago said, you can do your part for 8 years in the state house, or if you want to run for the state senate, same deal. If you want to be governor, secretary of state, treasurer, any of those statewide elected positions, you've got 8 years to do what you want, and then you need to go do something else. And as bittersweet as it is to have served for as long as I did, I'm still someone that thinks that term limits are an okay thing. And it's for a couple of reasons. I think, and especially, well, really at any level of politics, it is so hard to get started in this world And the power of incumbency, I can say, gives you a leg up, especially in a world where Citizens United rules and there is no real campaign finance reform, especially at the federal level. When you have tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars being spent in dark money that's unaccountable, it means that we need to level the playing field. And so whether that's real campaign finance reform, like publicly funded elections, or whether that is term limits, I think it's good to give people other people a shot at governing, and that should really be a strength of our democracy, um, because we should have involved citizens. And not to put too fine a point on it, but I was driving down to the Capitol to start cleaning up my office about a week and a half ago, and I was taking my 4-year-old daughter who loves going there. I mean, she was really crestfallen when I told her I wouldn't be coming back, and I tried to explain term limits to her, and I said, well, you know how I tell you and your brother sometimes you've got to take turns. This is what term limits are about. Is it was my turn for 8 years, and the law now says that it's somebody else's turn for another 8 years, maybe. And so she's kind of quiet in the car for a few minutes, and then, probably about 30 seconds into it, she goes, maybe it'll be my turn when I'm old enough. And I want people to think about that and think about, well, maybe it's your turn. And that's what a real citizen government should be about.
That must have been a real beautiful moment.
I said, I'm turning this car right back around, young lady. Yeah, there's no way that I'm letting you make $30,000 a year working, 100-hour weeks. It's not fair to anyone. Yeah. It was one of those quiet, proud moments for sure. And I'm grateful that my experience had such a profound, positive experience. It was such a profound experience for her.
That's awesome. So you alluded to it briefly, but let's talk about the benefits of being a legislator in the state of Colorado. It's not as glamorous as people might think.
Well, I think it depends on how you look at the concept of benefits. I will say that the people that sacrifice the most are my family. We say that we're in session for 120 days a year, but really, if you want to craft good legislation for almost 6 million residents in Colorado, you've got to do this year round. And I really, took full advantage of it. I think I passed over 100 pieces of legislation over 8 years, and uh, the reason that I did that is I felt like there wasn't time to waste. There's so many things going on, and whether it was for environmental justice or economic or racial justice, there's so many problems that needed solving. I couldn't sit still, and so what I did is basically start my mornings at 6 in the morning, and there were nights I didn't get home till midnight or later. There were some nights I didn't even make it home because we went till 3 or 4 in the morning, and I knew I had an 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock meeting that wasn't going to wait for me. And so rather than risk my life on the road or other people's lives on the road, there's there's places to stay nearby that thankfully people would put me up and put up with me. So it pays $30,000 a year. Well, now it's up to 40,000.
Oh,
40.
really?
Yeah, it's up to 40,000 now. But I always tell people, look, as a social worker, that's basically what I was making. I was basically doing the same hours, and I had more threats to my life as a social worker than I ever did as a lawmaker.
Really?
And
You get arrested on your life as a social worker?
if you're a child protection caseworker and you're trying to protect kids from violent family members, if they're going to be violent to kids, who aren't they going to be violent towards?
Wow.
And so I don't mean to be flippant about it. It's a serious thing. No one should feel like their life is at risk because they're passing either gun safety legislation or because they're trying to protect kids. But that's the reality of this of both. And so yeah, no, it's I've won, you know, now 1.5 halftime aides at the Capitol. They make $15 an hour because that's what the state pays. You bring in your own office equipment. You bring in you have one government issued iPad and one government issued laptop. That's kind of it. And so when you're representing 77,000 people, and trying to govern for 6 million people, um, you're given not a lot of tools to with a lot of responsibility. And like I said, sounds just like social work to me. And and I look back on it, and every minute was worth it.
Hmm. That sounds like a really rewarding time, and that's so cool that you've been able to do that. Now, I know people who are in DC that talk about how behind the scenes, Democrats and Republicans, they all are chummy and they, you know, go do their own, events together and whatnot. Does that occur in local politics too? Are Democrats and Republicans chummy behind the scenes? What's the environment like politically there? In the
Well,
Cap-
I didn't forget about behind the scenes. I would say 95% of my bills were bipartisan. There actually, it's really funny. There there was a court decision just a couple of days ago on a civil liberties issue that is so far under the radar, but important to people. So if you go through like a roundabout or a traffic circle right now and you don't use your turn signal, when you're getting in or getting out of that roundabout, you could actually be pulled over, ticketed, arrested if something else was going on. And that by itself could be probable cause to pull you over. And then there might be other crimes that you could be arrested for,
Mhm.
right? And in this day and age of defunding the police and criminal justice reform, I think that we had a bill to actually eliminate that ticketable offense. That bill died. The courts just upheld that concept, of what our bill was about, to say, you know what, it's too confusing for people to have to turn on and off their turn signals in a traffic circle, and probably creates more of a public safety hazard. So the courts did what the legislature couldn't. That bill was carried by a conservative Tea Party member, Senator Kevin Lundberg. I
Really?
w- he was the Senate sponsor. I was the House sponsor. And like I said, I think in the era of criminal justice reform, that bill probably would have stood a better chance, especially now that the Black Lives Matter movement has been able to step up. He and I did so many bills together on changing our child protection system, holding our county child welfare agencies accountable by creating a new third party office that would be able to oversee what they were doing. Because he and I both believe that, you know, kids aren't able to be lobbyists, and our government deserves to be accountable to the taxpayers.
Hmm.
He and I might come to different conclusions at the end of the day on so many different things, but that doesn't mean that we don't work together on the things that we do agree on. I always said, let's start where we agree. We'll see how far we get. Uh,
That's a great quote. I like that. What's your next steps? I mean, you unfortunately lost your primary election to Marta. Um, what's next for Mr. Singer?
you know, um, well, first of all, as soon as the election results were clear, I called her up, offered Marta my congratulations and my support, because I do think that, as important as the issues that I brought up, I'm not more important than the process. And the voters just happened to not think that it was my time. They wanted to support someone else, and that
This is
is.
close. You guys were right there, neck and neck, right?
Well, yeah, no, look, I'm not saying that I'm not staying up till the wee hours of the morning rethinking how I could have done it differently. But what I am saying is is that even in a close race, on the first day that we met and discussed this issue, I said, whoever wins, I just want you to let you know you've got my support if you're the victor. And so I'm holding to that. And I said, look, I look forward to getting our two teams together to talk about how we can come together. Because the number one thing on my mind right now is making sure that progressives across the ballot, everywhere from president to county commissioner, win this year. The stakes literally have never been higher. We say that every year, probably because it's true every year.
Mhm.
But it's now in the era of a pandemic and a fiscal crisis, and in the era of Black Lives Matter. it's even more important that we speak with one voice to the voters, and we can't let our differences overwhelm what is the larger issue at hand. So I'm going to be volunteering for causes that I believe in, which is no different than what I would do in any election year. Um, in terms of I get my family back. Originally I said running for office for the last 8.5 years, longer than that it seems like. 6 a.m. to midnight with two kids under the age of 5. They didn't get what they deserved, and they deserve to have a dad at home. And so they're sleeping in, which is why I'm out here in my backyard right now. And I'd love to get a job where I could actually afford a place to live on my own. I'm a renter right now, and my family deserves to be able to have a home of their own, and a life of their own. And so, as grateful as I am to my family, I'd love to be able to make sure that they get what they need. So I don't know what that means. I don't know if I'll run for office again. I'd like to say that, um, you know, uh, but I'm going to continue in public service. I don't know what that means in the short or in the long term, but if Biden wins, hopefully I can help them out on human services issues. If the state wants my help again at the executive branch level, I'd love to figure out a way that I could do that. The book is wide open right now, and it's just a matter of recalibrating and finding the next opportunity, because climate change isn't going to wait. It's going to happen. Same thing on mental health. Same thing on our opioid crisis. Same thing on our affordable housing crisis. So I did a lot with my title, but there's a lot of people that have done a lot more without a title.
Wow, that was very generous and courageous of you to talk so openly about those types of things. So thank you for that. I think that you should run for office again. You've done a great job so far, so I'd be happy to back you on whatever you decide to do. Speaking, let's rewind a little bit back to term limits. Federally, there's obviously no term limits. People at the head of both parties have been in office for 30, 40 years. What are your thoughts on that?
I actually worked with another Republican to actually work to end congressional term limits, or to bring in congressional term limits, the current system as it is. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention, I don't get a congressional retirement. That's
I
just,
know.
that was not on the table. That's, as a state legislator, you do not get, you pay into para like every state employee. So unless you're there for 20 or 30 years, you're not really going to see a whole lot. So, so in terms of congressional term limits, I do think that, I introduced legislation with actually the other Longmont representative, Lori Sane, who represents the Weld County side of Longmont, and said, we should really, rethink our Constitution in this day and age. Once again, not very popular. Didn't get any yes votes in our first committee. So, for every bill that I ran that passed, there were a handful that didn't pass. But the idea was really to start a conversation about making sure that residents know that they can be involved in our system, and that it's honestly, if we didn't have term limits, I don't think the criminal justice reforms that we did in the last couple of years would have happened. If you get the same people doing the same thing over and over, you're going to get the same outcome. It's very rare that people change and change their minds. It's beautiful when it happens, but it's very rare. And so the last minute work that I did to make sure that the governor had the ability to do a mass pardon of anyone convicted of possession of marijuana under 2 ounces probably wouldn't have happened 6 or 7 years ago, because the people there, they weren't beholden to special interests. They were beholden to an older way of thinking, and a way of thinking in the past. And we need to progress fast as a society, especially now. We don't have time to waste.
That brings up an interesting point. So within the legislature in this Colorado state government, what would you say the breakdown would be between conservatives and progressives?
That's an interesting loaded question, actually. So in the state legislature, I'll start off by saying, so in the House right now, there are 65 lawmakers. In the Senate, there are 35 lawmakers. This makes for an even 100. So good round numbers to count around. Right now, we have 19 Democrats in the Senate, 17 Republicans. And so basically, it's a pretty close, it's a slim margin there. In the House, it's a little different. We have 41 Democrats, 24 Republicans. It's almost a supermajority at this point.
Wow.
And so with a commanding majority like that, there is there's an impression that, that means Democrats can sort of run roughshod over any sort of Republican issue. And I will say, every bill that came up to ban abortion died pretty quickly. I will also say, though, that even this year, over 90% of the bills that passed had bipartisan votes. At least one Republican, if not 10 or 20 or dozens, voted for the majority of our legislation, and that's because most legislation isn't inherently political. There's only a couple of ways that you can talk about certain issues. When you're dealing with, uh, the Department of Agriculture. Department of Agriculture is not an inherently political place. We may have our differences on things like GMOs and pesticides, but ultimately we all want farmers to be successful, right?
Mhm.
So it's a pretty commanding divide in the House, and it'll probably remain that way for a couple of years. The Senate sort of hangs by a thread between Democrats and Republicans. I'll say within that, though, Democratic Party is pretty big tent, and so that means that not every Democrat is going to toe the same line that I do. I mean, I really had to work to pull teeth to do a lot of the things that I wanted to do as a lawmaker, even with my own colleagues. And so one of the first bills I ever ran was on the concept of wage theft. This is the concept that if your employer promises to pay you, they should pay you, right? We are against slavery in this country. And
Yes.
so I said, just like you steal a car or a TV and you can go to jail, if you steal someone's wages, their ability to put a roof over their head or feed their families, that should be a crime too. That should be treated like theft. That bill died its first year. It died the second year. And the third year, we were able to create an administrative mediation process. Still wasn't sending people to jail. Last year, finally, the Human Trafficking Commission came back to us and they said, this is how human traffickers operate. They don't pay people their wages. We want a front door or a side door to get these human traffickers out of our system and in jail and prison. And at that point, this bill that I couldn't convince enough Democrats, definitely couldn't convince any Republicans, became a bipartisan bill, passed with, I think, 3 no votes
Wow.
total, like minimal. It might have been 0 no votes. And so, partisan differences are important. Majorities matter. The civil unions bill that I saw in 2012 died not because it wasn't bipartisan. It was. It was because the Speaker of the House was a Republican and wasn't going to see that bill pass, and
Uh,
made sure through rules that that the bill never saw the light of day. And so after it passed 3 committees, it died on the House floor, basically at midnight on the last possible day to pass it. And um, the voters saw that in 2012 and gave Democrats a majority the next year, and it was a bipartisan bill that passed. And so I think partisanship plays a huge role in our political system. Just not it's sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But what I will say is that a lot of our solutions, I mean, vast supermajority of our solutions are bipartisan.
that's nice to see. You'd like to see people working together. I mean, whether they do it on the federal level is one thing, but it's good to see that they're at least doing it.
I agree. Yeah.
So, Jonathan, I really appreciate all the time you spent with us. Do you have any parting words for our audience?
I would say, I'm going to steal some other words that have been attributed to Thomas Jefferson, but, the price of democracy is eternal vigilance. And so, regardless of where you stand on any particular election, any particular year, keep fighting for what you believe in, because change doesn't happen overnight. But if you keep fighting, it means you're winning, and you just maybe haven't won yet. So keep up the fight for what you believe in, and I will be there right by your side on those progressive causes that we care about.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks.
I learned a lot speaking with Jonathan Singer, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Until next time, stay savvy.